in the heart of London's glittering season, where a young lady's future could be secured with a single dance, one whisper held the power to destroy everything. For Annalise Croft, that whisper was about to become a roar. She stood on the precipice of a perfect dream, her hand in that of the most sought-after bachelor, Lord Richard Bowmont. The entire ballroom watched, certain they were witnessing the season's greatest love story unfold. They were wrong. They were about to witness a sacrifice, a public execution of a woman's heart, and in that vast, unforgiving ocean of silks and jewels, only one man, a duke feared for his cold heart, would dare to swim against the tide of scorn. The chandeliers of the Ashworth ballroom dripped with crystal light, scattering fractured rainbows across the polished marble floor. A sea of society's finest ebbed and flowed with the rhythm of the orchestra, a kaleidoscope of vibrant silks, intricate lace, and the flash of heirloom diamonds. To Miss Annalise Croft, it felt like a dream she had been rehearsing for her entire life. Her gown, a simple but elegant creation of pale blue silk, was a testament to her mother's frantic savings, a final, desperate wager on the marriage market. Her heart, however, paid no mind to their precarious finances. It beat a frantic, joyful rhythm against her ribs, a rhythm that belonged entirely to Lord Richard Bowmont. He stood before her, his smile as brilliant as the gems on his cravat. He was everything a young woman was taught to desire, handsome, charming, and heir to a considerable fortune. For the past 6 weeks, he had been her most ardent pursuer, his attention so public, so unwavering, that their engagement was considered a foregone conclusion. "You are a vision tonight, Annalise," Richard murmured, his voice a low, intimate caress that sent a shiver down her spine. He lifted her gloved hand to his lips, his eyes never leaving hers. "The most radiant bloom in this entire garden." Annalise blushed, a warmth spreading through her chest that had nothing to do with the stuffy ballroom air. "My lord, you flatter me." "I speak only the truth," he insisted, his thumb gently stroking the back of her hand. "Soon the whole world will know it. Wait here. I have something to discuss with my father. Do not move from this spot. I want everyone to see you waiting for me." Her heart soared. This was it. The moment her mother had prayed for. The moment that would save her family from the quiet desperation that haunted their modest townhouse. Richard was going to speak to his father, the formidable Earl of Danbury, and then he would return to make their union official. She nodded, her smile feeling as if it might split her face. "I will be right here." He squeezed her hand one last time before melting back into the crowd. Annalise stood near a grand pillar, a perfect vantage point from which to be seen. She felt 100 pairs of eyes on her, a mixture of envy from the other debutantes and calculating approval from the matchmaking mummers. She held her head high, the picture of serene confidence, though her insides were a whirlwind of giddy anticipation. The minutes stretched into an eternity. The orchestra began a new waltz. Couples swirled past her, a dizzying array of color and sound. She watched Richard across the room, standing with his father and another man she didn't recognize. He was animated, laughing at something his father said. He glanced her way once, his eyes locking with hers, and he gave a small, conspiratorial nod. The knot of anxiety in her stomach loosened. Then, something shifted. Lady Beatrice Finch, a woman known for her sharp tongue and even sharper ambition, approached Richard's group. Her gown was a flamboyant crimson, a stark contrast to Annalise's modest blue, and she dripped with rubies that seemed to drink the light. Annalise watched as Beatrice laid a hand on Richard's arm, her laughter loud and possessive. Annalise's smile faltered. Beatrice was the daughter of a marquess, a far more advantageous match. But Richard had assured her, sworn to her, that his affections were hers alone. She clung to that promise as she watched the scene unfold. The Earl of Danbury smiled broadly at Beatrice, clapping his son on the back. Richard, who had promised to return to Annalise, now offered his arm to Beatrice. A cold dread, heavy and suffocating, began to seep into Annalise's veins. It couldn't be. It was surely a misunderstanding. The music swelled to a crescendo, and the Marquis of Ashworth, their host, called for silence. A hush fell over the 300 guests. Every face turned towards the centre of the room, where the Marquis stood beside the Earl of Danbury. "My lords, ladies, and esteemed guests," the Marquis began, his voice booming through the hall, "it is with immense pleasure that I yield the floor to my dear friend, the Earl of Danbury, who has a most joyous announcement to make." Annalise's blood ran cold. She couldn't breathe. This wasn't how it was supposed to happen. Richard was supposed to be by her side. The Earl beamed, his chest puffed with pride. "Thank you, Ashworth. It is indeed a joyous night. It gives me the greatest pride, as a father and as a peer of this realm, to announce the formal betrothal of my son and heir, Lord Richard Bowmont." Annalise's world tilted on its axis. She saw Richard standing with Beatrice, her hand tucked possessively in his elbow. He was looking directly at Annalise, and for the first time, she saw not affection in his eyes, but a cold, mocking amusement. "To the truly incomparable Lady Beatrice Finch," the Earl concluded. The announcement was met with a roar of applause and delighted murmurs. It was the match of the season, a perfect union of title, fortune, and influence. For Annalise, the sound was a physical blow. The air was punched from her lungs. Her heart, which had been soaring only moments before, shattered into a million icy fragments. The dream was over. This was the reality, a cold, calculated betrayal played out on the grandest stage imaginable. He had made her stand there, a spectacle of his conquest and his cruelty. He had wanted everyone to see her waiting for him, only to cast her aside for a better prize. The whispers began almost immediately, sharp and venomous. "Did you see her face?" The poor thing actually thought he was serious. "The Croft girl? Oh, please, her father is practically a pauper. She was a pleasant enough distraction, I suppose." How utterly humiliating, to be discarded so publicly. She'll never recover from this. Each word was a fresh shard of glass, twisting in her soul. Her vision blurred with unshed tears. The vibrant colours of the ballroom swam together into a nauseating mess. She felt faint, her legs trembling beneath her. She had to get out. But the crowd, sensing blood in the water, seemed to press in on her, their curious, pitying and scornful gazes pinning her to the spot. She was trapped, nakedly exposed in her devastation. She looked at Richard one last time. He raised his champagne flute in a toast, his eyes meeting hers over the rim. He gave her a slight, almost imperceptible smirk, a final twist of the knife. Her composure broke. A single tear escaped, tracing a hot, shameful path down her cheek. The room began to spin, and just as her legs gave way, as the darkness threatened to swallow her whole, a shadow fell over her. The entire ballroom seemed to hold its breath. The whispers died. The laughter froze. Every head turned. For moving through the crowd, parting the sea of gawking aristocrats like a ship of the line, was a man no one ever expected to intervene in such trivial matters. He was tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in immaculate, severe black that stood in stark contrast to the evening's finery. His face was a mask of cold, aristocratic indifference, his dark eyes missing nothing. It was Gideon Blackwood, the Duke of Northumberland, the Ruthless Duke, a man whose vast fortune was matched only by his fearsome reputation. He was a creature of darkness and power, a recluse who rarely graced society with his presence, and when he did, it was with an unnerving, silent intensity. He was the last man in England anyone would have expected to show a shred of compassion, and he was the only one who moved. Gideon Blackwood didn't speak. He didn't need to. His presence was a command, an indictment of the collective cruelty of the room. The air around him seemed to crackle with an unspoken power, silencing the gossipers and making even the most arrogant lords feel small. His gaze swept over the crowd, a chilling, dismissive glance that made people shrink back, suddenly ashamed of their voyeuristic pleasure in Annalise's pain. His eyes, the colour of a stormy sea, finally settled on her. Annalise flinched, expecting to see the same mockery and pity she saw in every other face. But she found neither. Instead, there was something else, something unreadable and intense, a flicker of recognition. It was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by a cool, impenetrable mask. He stopped directly in front of her, a bulwark between her and the prying eyes of the ton. He was so close she could smell the faint, clean scent of rain and leather that clung to his coat, a stark contrast to the cloying perfumes of the ballroom. He stood there for a moment, simply observing her. His silence, a strange and unnerving comfort. He wasn't offering platitudes or empty sympathies. He was offering a shield. Then he acted, with an economy of movement that was both graceful and predatory. He shrugged off his own tailored evening coat. It was a gesture of such profound impropriety in a formal ballroom that a collective gasp rippled through the onlookers. He didn't offer the coat to her. He draped it around her shoulders. The fine wool was heavy and warm, instantly chasing away the bone-deep chill that had settled over her. It smelled of him, a scent that was grounding in the spinning chaos of her mind. It swallowed her simple blue dress, cocooning her in an anonymous, protective darkness. "Miss Croft," he said. His voice was not what she expected. It wasn't a growl or a bark, as his reputation might suggest. It was a low, resonant baritone, smooth as polished obsidian, but with an edge that promised it could cut just as deep. It was a voice accustomed to being obeyed without question. She could only stare up at him, her shattered heart still pounding a frantic, painful rhythm. She tried to form a word, a thank you, anything, but her throat was tight with unshed sobs. The Duke's gaze flickered past her, towards the centre of the room, where Richard Bowmont and Lady Beatrice were now watching, their triumphant expressions curdling into confusion and outrage. A muscle feathered in the Duke's jaw, a subtle sign of his displeasure. He then looked back down at Annalise, and his next words were for her alone, spoken so quietly no one else could possibly hear. "This display is beneath you. Your tears will only give them satisfaction. Do not grant them that." His words were not kind. They were not gentle. They were a command, sharp and direct. Yet, strangely, they were the most fortifying words she had heard all night. He wasn't pitying her weakness. He was appealing to a strength she didn't know she possessed. He was treating her not as a fragile, broken doll, but as a soldier in a battle she was about to lose. He offered her his arm. It was a stark, powerful gesture. The arm of the most powerful, enigmatic, and feared man in England, offered to the most humiliated woman of the season. To accept it would be to trade one scandal for another, to tie her name to a man shrouded in dark rumours. To refuse it would be to remain here, drowning in the syrupy poison of society's judgment. Her hand trembled as she lifted it. Her fingers, still encased in their white glove, brushed against the black wool of his sleeve. The contact sent a strange jolt through her. She placed her hand on his arm, and his muscles tensed beneath her touch, solid and unyielding as granite. He did not smile. He simply nodded, a curt, decisive gesture. With Annalise on his arm, he turned. He did not hurry. He did not flee. He began to walk, leading her directly through the heart of the ballroom. The path before them cleared as if by magic. Lords and ladies scrambled to get out of his way, their expressions a mixture of awe, fear, and rabid curiosity. The silence was absolute. The only sounds were the soft scuff of his boots on the marble and the frantic, ragged whisper of her own breathing. Annalise kept her eyes fixed on the floor, unable to bear the hundreds of stares. The Duke's coat was a shield, but she could still feel their gazes like physical blows. As they passed the center of the room, she chanced a glance up. Richard's face was a thundercloud of fury and disbelief. His prize, Lady Beatrice, looked positively venomous, her ruby lips pulled into a sneer. The Duke of Northumberland had just stolen their moment, eclipsing their grand announcement with his own unprecedented, scandalous act of chivalry. He hadn't just rescued Annalise, he had publicly snubbed the Earl of Danbury and his heir. The Duke did not so much as glance in their direction. To him, they were nothing. The entire spectacle was beneath his notice. His focus was solely on escorting her from the room. They reached the grand double doors of the ballroom, and the footmen, their faces pale and eyes wide, scrambled to open them. The cool night air of the corridor was a blessed relief. The Duke did not stop until they were in the relative seclusion of the grand entrance hall. He finally released her arm and turned to face her. In the muted light of the hall, she could see the hard lines of his face more clearly. He was handsome, but not in the charming, easy way of Richard Bowmont. His was a stark, severe beauty, carved from granite and shadow. There were lines of weariness or pain etched around his eyes that his youth could not quite conceal. "My carriage is being brought around," he stated, not asked. "It will take you home." "Your Grace," Annalise whispered, her voice hoarse. I don't know how to thank you." "Do not thank me," he said, his tone clipped. "I have no patience for public theatrics, and Lord Bowmont is an insufferable peacock. His preening was an offence to my evening." He was dismissing his own extraordinary act as a mere whim, an expression of his own annoyance. He was offering her an escape from gratitude, a way to preserve what little dignity she had left. He was giving her a reason for his actions that had nothing to do with pity. A footman appeared at the door, bowing low. "Your Grace, your carriage is here." The Duke gave a sharp nod. He looked at Annalise one last time. "Go home, Miss Croft. The world will talk. Let them. Words are wind. Do not let them blow you over." Without another word, he turned on his heel and walked back towards the ballroom, leaving her standing in the entrance hall, cloaked in the warmth of his coat and the shocking, unnerving mercy of a ruthless man. The following morning, Annalise's name was on the lips of every person of consequence in London. The story of Lord Beaumont's cruel public jilting was scandalous enough, but it was the Duke of Northumberland's intervention that had truly set the city ablaze with gossip. It was an unprecedented act from a man who treated society as a tiresome obligation he could barely tolerate. In the drawing rooms of Mayfair, theories were spun like silk. "He must have a vested interest in the Crofts," opined Lady Danvers to a rapt audience. "Perhaps her father, a Mr. Samuel Croft, holds some debt of the Duke's." This was met with scornful laughter. "My dear Agatha, the Duke of Northumberland has no debts. He is the bank," corrected Viscount Pembroke. "No, it must be something more personal. Perhaps the girl is a distant, unacknowledged relative. Or perhaps," hissed a young debutante, fanning herself furiously. He simply wishes to possess her. They say he collects beautiful, broken things. At White's, the gentlemen's club on St. James's Street, the wagers were already being laid. The odds on whether the Duke would make Annalise his mistress were 3-1. The odds of him actually marrying her were an astronomical 50-1. Lord Richard Bowmont, nursing a brandy and a bruised ego, found himself the subject of ridicule rather than admiration. "Damned audacious of Northumberland," muttered a friend, trying to sound sympathetic. "To stride in and steal your thunder like that. Made you look a fool, Bowmont." Richard slammed his glass down. He made himself look a fool, interfering in matters that do not concern him. He saddled himself with a ruined, penniless chit. What could he possibly want with her? But the question lingered in the air, unanswered. What did the ruthless Duke want with Annalise Croft? Meanwhile, in a sprawling, silent mansion overlooking Green Park, Gideon Blackwood stood before a large window, staring out at the grey London sky. The Duke's residence was much like the man himself, imposing, elegant, and devoid of any unnecessary warmth or sentiment. "The papers are calling it the Duke's Defiance," said a calm voice from behind him. Gideon did not turn. Let them call it what they will. The press are hounds who must always have a fox to chase. Mr. Thomas Finch, a distant and far more sensible cousin to Lady Beatrice, stepped forward. He was the Duke's man of affairs, a solicitor by trade, and one of the only people in the world who could speak to Gideon with any degree of familiarity. "You've made an enemy of the Earl of Danbury," Thomas noted, adjusting his spectacles, "and you've turned a simple debutante into the most talked-about woman in England. That was not a subtle move, Your Grace. Subtlety is a tool of the weak, Thomas. It is the art of getting what you want without anyone knowing you wanted it. I am not weak, and I did not want anything. I merely acted." "Why?" Thomas asked, his curiosity finally getting the better of his professional decorum. "It was uncharacteristic." Gideon was silent for a long moment, his gaze distant. The rain began to streak down the window pane, mirroring a memory that was always just beneath the surface. 15 years ago, he said, his voice losing its harsh edge, replaced by a quiet, chilling flatness. "I watched my mother stand in a courtroom. My father had just died, leaving his affairs in a tangle of debt and deceit. His business partners, men who had toasted his health and shared his table for years, turned on her. They called her a liar, a spendthrift, a fool who knew nothing of a man's world. They picked her apart, piece by piece, in front of everyone. And no one moved. No one said a word." He finally turned from the window, his eyes dark with the ghosts of the past. "I saw the same look in Miss Croft's eyes last night, the look of someone being devoured by a pack of well-dressed wolves. I will not stand by and watch that happen again." Thomas Finch understood. The Duke's ruthlessness wasn't born of malice, but of a deep, abiding cynicism for the world that had so carelessly broken his mother. He had built his fortune, his power, his impenetrable fortress of a reputation to ensure no one could ever touch him or anyone he chose to protect in that way again. "What will you do now?" Thomas asked. "The girl's reputation is in tatters. Bowmont may have discarded her, but you've made her notorious. No respectable man will approach her now." "Respectable men are often the most contemptible," Gideon retorted. "Her reputation is not my concern. Her survival is." He walked over to his desk, his movements precise and purposeful. "You've been investigating Lord Bowmont's financial dealings, have you not? His recent investments in the Albion Trading Syndicate?" Thomas nodded. "Yes. It appears quite profitable on the surface, but the paperwork is opaque. It's a very exclusive venture. He's brought in a number of trusting gentlemen, including, I've discovered, a Mr. Samuel Croft." Gideon's expression hardened. Her father. Yes, he invested what little capital he had left, hoping to secure a dowry for his daughter. Bowmont assured him the returns would be magnificent. "Bowmont didn't just break the girl's heart," Gideon said, a dangerous quiet in his voice. "He targeted her family. He used the promise of marriage to lure her father into a financial trap. He intended to ruin them completely, to leave them with nothing after he had tired of his little game." The pieces clicked into place. This wasn't just a simple, cruel rejection. It was a calculated, predatory act of destruction. "I want you to find everything, Thomas," the Duke commanded. "Every ledger, every investor, every secret account. Dig into the Albion Trading Syndicate until you find its rotten core. Lord Bowmont wanted a public spectacle. He is about to get one." Gideon picked up a piece of blank stationery and a pen. His handwriting was as sharp and severe as he was. "And what of Miss Croft?" Thomas asked. Gideon paused in his writing. "Miss Croft," he said, a strange, unreadable expression on his face, "is about to receive an offer she cannot possibly refuse." He was not simply going to save her. He was going to arm her. 3 days after the ball, a black carriage bearing the crest of the Duke of Northumberland, a lone wolf on a field of sable, stopped before the modest Croft residence. The sight sent the entire street into a flurry of curtain-twitching and hushed speculation. For Annalise, the past 3 days had been a living purgatory. She hadn't left the house. Her mother had taken to her bed with a case of nerves, and her father, Samuel, had sequestered himself in his study, his face a grim mask of worry. The few condolence cards they had received felt more like notes of pitying fascination. Annalise felt like a ghost in her own home, haunted by the memory of Richard's smirk and the weight of the Duke's coat. She had returned the coat the next day, via a messenger, with a formal, stilted note of thanks. She had expected that to be the end of it. When the Duke's footman delivered the letter, her father had opened it with trembling hands. His face went from pale to ashen. The letter was not a social call. It was a summons. The Duke of Northumberland requested a private meeting with Miss Annalise Croft and her father that very afternoon. Now she sat in their worn but tidy drawing-room, her hands clenched in her lap. Her father paced before the fireplace, his anxiety palpable. "I don't understand this, Annalise," he muttered for the 10th time. "What could a man like that want with us? This is about the scandal, it must be. He means to make some sort of arrangement." The unspoken word mistress hung in the air between them, ugly and terrifying. Annalise felt a flush of shame, but it was quickly replaced by a flicker of defiance. The man who had looked at her with such cold command, who had told her not to grant her tormentors the satisfaction of her tears, did not seem like the sort of man who would make such a tawdry proposal. Or perhaps that was just wishful thinking. When the Duke was announced, he seemed to fill their small drawing-room, his height and the sheer force of his presence diminishing everything around him. He was dressed not for a social call, but for business, in a dark, impeccably tailored suit. He gave a curt nod to her father, and then his eyes found Annalise. "Mr. Croft, Miss Croft, thank you for seeing me." His voice was as she remembered it, deep, controlled, and utterly devoid of pleasantries. "Your Grace," Samuel Croft stammered, gesturing to a chair. "Please, can I offer you some tea?" "No, thank you," the Duke said, remaining standing. "I will not take up much of your time. I am here to discuss a matter of business." He looked directly at Annalise. "The business of Lord Bowmont." Annalise's breath hitched. Her father stiffened, My daughter has suffered enough on that man's account, Samuel said, a flash of paternal anger cutting through his fear. We have nothing more to say about him. On the contrary, the Duke replied smoothly, I believe you have a great deal more to lose to him. You are an investor in the Albion Trading Syndicate. Are you not, Mr. Croft? Samuel's face went slack with shock. How did you know that? It is my business to know things, Gideon said. I also know that the Syndicate is a fiction. It is a shell corporation designed by Bowmont to swindle unsuspecting gentlemen out of their capital. The funds are being funneled to his personal accounts offshore. Within a month, the Syndicate will collapse, and every investor will be ruined. You, Mr. Croft, will lose everything. The colour drained completely from her father's face. He stumbled back and sank into a chair, his hand over his heart. Annalise felt a new wave of cold horror wash over her. Richard hadn't just been cruel, he had been monstrous. He had courted her while systematically planning to bankrupt her father. Why are you telling us this? Annalise asked, finding her voice. It was steadier than she expected. The Duke's gaze remained fixed on her. He seemed pleased that she was the one who had spoken. Because I despise cheats, and because I believe you, Miss Croft, are in a unique position to help me expose him. Me? She breathed, incredulous. What could I possibly do? Bowmont believes you are a broken, weeping mess. He believes your family is weak and inconsequential. He will not see you coming, Gideon explained. I have the financial evidence, the proof of his fraud. But proof is cold. To truly destroy a man like Bowmont, you must dismantle his reputation, his social standing. That requires a performance. Your performance. He laid out his plan. It was audacious, brilliant, and terrifying. He didn't want to hide her away from the scandal. He wanted her to lean into it. He would sponsor her. He would dress her, host her, and reintroduce her to the very society that had cast her out. She would not be the pitiable victim. She would be the Duke of Northumberland's protégé, a woman of mystery and power. You will attend the upcoming masquerade ball at the Vauxhall Gardens on my arm, he stated. Bowmont and Lady Beatrice will be there, celebrating their engagement. You will not hide behind a mask of shame. You will wear one of confidence. You will laugh. You will dance. You will show them that you are not broken, but liberated. Your happiness will be a far sharper weapon than your tears. This is madness, her father whispered, to throw her back to the wolves. She will not be a lamb this time, Gideon said, his eyes still locked on Annalise. She will be with the wolf. He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. While you hold their attention, my agents will be making their final moves. The story of Bowmont's fraud will break the following morning. But it will be your image, poised, powerful, and utterly indifferent to him. That will be the final nail in his coffin. Society can forgive a financial crime. It never forgives being made to look foolish. It was a pact with the devil, a dance with the darkness. He was offering her not just safety, but vengeance, a chance to reclaim her narrative, to rewrite the story of her humiliation into one of triumph. It was a terrifying prospect to face those people again, to pretend a confidence she did not feel. Why? She asked again, her voice a near whisper. Why are you doing this for me? For the first time, the Duke's impenetrable mask seemed to soften, just for a fraction of a second. A flicker of that 15-year-old memory crossed his features. Let's just say, he said, his voice dropping to that low, intimate tone he'd used in the ballroom, that I have an investment to protect. I wagered on your strength, Miss Croft. I do not like to lose my wagers. He was offering her an alliance, not pity, a partnership, not charity. He was giving her back her agency. Annalise looked at her father, who was staring at her, his expression a mixture of fear and hope. She thought of Richard's mocking smirk. She thought of the whispers and the scorn. Then she looked at the formidable, ruthless Duke, who saw not a broken girl, but a weapon waiting to be wielded. She straightened her spine, lifting her chin. "When do we begin, Your Grace?" A slow, dangerous smile touched Gideon Blackwood's lips. It was not a warm smile, but it was one of profound satisfaction. "We have already begun." The transformation of Annalise Croft began immediately. The Duke's resources were seemingly limitless. A modiste, Madame Dubois, a formidable Frenchwoman who typically only worked for royalty, arrived at the Croft residence with an army of assistants and bolts of luxurious fabrics. Annalise was measured, draped, and fitted for a new wardrobe that was the antithesis of her former self. Gone were the pale pastels and simple muslins of a hopeful debutante. In their place were gowns of deep jewel tones, emerald green, sapphire blue, and a rich garnet, cut in elegant, commanding styles. But the Duke's tutelage went far beyond silks and satins. He met with her daily, sometimes in her family's small drawing room, which he always seemed to dominate, and sometimes during carriage rides through Hyde Park, away from prying ears. These were not lessons in etiquette. She already knew which fork to use. These were lessons in power. "Society is a chessboard," he told her one afternoon, as they watched the fashionable parade of carriages from his own. "And every interaction is a move. Bowmont and his ilk play a simple game. They move their pieces forward, expecting to capture the weaker ones. They do not anticipate a pawn that refuses to be taken." He taught her to observe, to listen to what wasn't being said. He coached her on how to meet a condescending gaze with cool indifference, how to turn an intrusive question back on the asker, how to use silence as a statement. He was a demanding teacher, dissecting her posture, her tone of voice, her slightest hesitation. "Do not fidget," he'd command. "It signals nervousness. Keep your hands still. When you walk into a room, do not scan for friendly faces. Assume you are the most important person there, and let them find you." Annalise was a surprisingly adept student. The pain of her humiliation had burned away her naivete, leaving behind a core of tempered steel she never knew she possessed. She absorbed his lessons, not just because she trusted him, but because she discovered a part of herself that thrived on the strategy, the quiet battle of wills. Their time together began to change. The stark lines of their teacher-student relationship started to blur at the edges. She began to see past the ruthless Duke and glimpse the man beneath. She saw the subtle way his eyes would soften when her father, buoyed by the Duke's private assurances that his investment would be recovered, would tell a lengthy, rambling story. She noticed the dry, incisive wit that would surface in his rare moments of unguardedness. One evening, he brought her a book, not poetry or a novel, but a treatise on Greek philosophy. "Read the chapter on Stoicism," he said, handing it to her. "It teaches the difference between what we can control and what we cannot. You cannot control what people say about you. You can control your reaction to it. That is the source of all power." "Is that how you live, Your Grace?" she asked quietly. "By controlling everything?" His gaze was intense. "I live by not allowing the world to control me. There is a difference." She found herself thinking about him constantly, long after he had departed for the day. She wondered about the sadness she sometimes saw lurking deep in his eyes, the source of the formidable walls he had built around himself. Their alliance, born of vengeance and strategy, was becoming something more complex, an intricate dance of two lonely, wounded souls finding a strange and unexpected harmony. The whispers about them, of course, grew louder and more frantic. To be seen in the Duke of Northumberland's carriage day after day was a scandal of the highest order. But under his guidance, Annalise learned to weather the storm. When Lady Danvers accosted her in a bookshop, demanding to know the nature of her relationship with the Duke, Annalise simply met her gaze with cool calm. "His Grace," Annalise replied, her voice even and clear, "is a proponent of Stoic philosophy. He finds my recent tribulations a fascinating case study in emotional resilience. I believe he is writing a paper on it." The absurd academic explanation left Lady Danvers utterly speechless, and the story that circulated afterwards painted Annalise not as a fallen woman, but as a bizarre intellectual curiosity of the eccentric Duke, a narrative far more confusing and intriguing to the ton. The night of the Vauxhall Gardens masquerade ball arrived on a wave of nervous anticipation. Madame Dubois had delivered her masterpiece, a gown of the deepest midnight silk, embroidered with silver thread that glittered like a constellation. The mask that accompanied it was a simple, elegant creation of black lace and silver, hiding her identity, but accentuating the new, confident spark in her eyes. When Gideon arrived to collect her, he fell silent. He was dressed in formal black, a stark raven amongst the peacocks of society, his only adornment a silver wolf's head pin on his cravat. His mask was unadorned black silk, making his presence even more menacing and enigmatic. He stared at her for a long moment, his eyes sweeping over her from head to toe. She felt a blush rise to her cheeks, but she held his gaze, her posture straight and proud, just as he had taught her. "The board is set, Miss Croft," he said, his voice a low murmur. He offered his arm, and this time she took it without a tremor. "It is time to make our move." As they stepped into his carriage, she felt a thrill of fear mixed with a heady sense of power. She was no longer the frightened girl cowering by a pillar. She was a queen on the chessboard, guarded by the most powerful piece in the game, and she was ready to declare checkmate. The Vauxhall Pleasure Gardens were a fantasy land of light and shadow. Thousands of lanterns hung from the trees, casting a magical glow over the winding paths, ornate pavilions, and the grand rotunda where the orchestra played. The air was filled with music, laughter, and the rustle of silk as hundreds of masked guests revelled in the delicious anonymity of the masquerade. When the Duke of Northumberland and his mysterious companion in midnight silk arrived, a palpable ripple went through the crowd. All eyes were drawn to the tall, imposing figure in black and the woman on his arm who moved with a newfound, regal grace. Whispers followed them like the train of her gown. No one was certain of her identity, but everyone had their suspicions. They did not seek out the center of attention. Instead, Gideon led Annalise on a leisurely stroll through the less crowded pathways, a deliberate move to heighten the suspense. He was a master of theatrics, and he was making the entire assembly wait, watch, and wonder. "Are you ready?" he murmured, his voice close to her ear. "I am," she replied, and was surprised to find that it was the truth. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was overshadowed by a fierce, burning resolve. They eventually made their way to the main promenade, where Richard Bowmont and Lady Beatrice held court. Richard was dressed as a Roman emperor, his costume ostentatious and slightly ridiculous. Beatrice was an equally gaudy Cleopatra. They were laughing loudly, basking in the glow of their recent engagement and social triumph. Annalise felt a pang of her old hurt, a ghost of the girl who had loved him. But when she looked at him now, she saw not the charming suitor, but a hollow man, a predator draped in finery. Gideon guided her directly into their path. "Lord Bowmont, Lady Beatrice," the Duke said, his voice dripping with false pleasantry. A spectacular evening. Richard and Beatrice froze. They turned, and their eyes landed on the masked woman on the Duke's arm. Richard's eyes narrowed in suspicion, while Beatrice's gaze was pure venom. "Your Grace," Richard said stiffly, "we are surprised to see you, and you have brought a guest." "I find I am developing a new appreciation for society's amusements," Gideon replied smoothly. He then looked down at Annalise. "My dear, would you not agree that the lights are particularly lovely tonight?" He prompted her to speak. This was her first test. Annalise tilted her head, her voice light and musical, betraying none of her inner turmoil. "Indeed. They make everything seem so much more dramatic. It's amazing what a little clever illumination can hide in the shadows." There was a subtle challenge in her tone that did not go unnoticed. Richard stared at her, a flicker of uneasy recognition in his eyes. He knew that voice, but the confidence, the poise, it was all wrong. "Have we been introduced?" Lady Beatrice asked sharply, her eyes raking over Annalise's gown with envy. Before Annalise could reply, the Duke interjected. "Introductions are so tedious at a masquerade, are they not? It ruins the mystery." His hand tightened ever so slightly on Annalise's arm, a silent signal. "It is time." Just then, a commotion arose from the entrance to the gardens. A group of men, dressed in the severe, practical attire of city officials and Bow Street runners, entered the promenade. They were led by a stern-faced man who was clearly in charge. Panic and confusion rippled through the festive crowd. The officials made a direct line for Lord Bowmont. "Lord Richard Bowmont?" the lead official asked, his voice cutting through the music. Richard's face paled beneath his tan. "Yes? What is the meaning of this intrusion?" "I am an officer of the Crown," the man announced, holding up a warrant. "You are under arrest on suspicion of fraud, conspiracy and embezzlement in the matter of the Albion Trading Syndicate." A collective gasp went through the crowd. Lady Beatrice took a step back from Richard, as if he were suddenly diseased. The Earl of Danbury, who had been holding court nearby, rushed forward, his face purple with rage. "This is an outrage! On whose authority do you act?" The official did not look at the Earl. He looked past him, his eyes finding the Duke of Northumberland, who stood watching the proceedings with a detached, almost bored expression. The official gave a barely perceptible nod of acknowledgement. It was in that moment that Richard understood. His eyes darted from the officials to the impassive Duke, and then to the masked woman on his arm. His face contorted in a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. He finally knew. "You!" he spat, his voice trembling with rage. "This is your doing." Now was Annalise's moment, the climax of the entire chess match. With a slow, deliberate movement, she raised a hand and untied the ribbons of her mask. She let it fall away, revealing her face to the stunned onlookers. Her expression was not one of triumph or glee. It was one of serene, cool pity. She looked at the man who had shattered her heart, now being unmasked himself as a common criminal. "It seems the lights have failed, my lord," she said, her voice carrying clearly in the sudden silence. "And there is nothing left to hide in the shadows." The unmasking was complete. Richard Bowmont, the celebrated catch of the season, was exposed as a fraudster. Lady Beatrice Finch stared, her mouth agape, at the public implosion of her glorious engagement. And Annalise Croft, the girl he had tried to destroy, stood before him not as a victim, but as the architect of his downfall, flanked by the one man in London he would never have dared to cross. The officers took Richard by the arms. As they led him away, a disgraced Roman emperor, stripped of his power. His final desperate gaze fell on Annalise. She did not look away. She simply held his gaze, a silent testament to the fact that he had chosen the wrong woman to break. The fallout was immediate and spectacular. The scandal of Lord Bowmont's arrest and the collapse of the Albion trading syndicate dominated every newspaper and conversation for weeks. The Earl of Danbury's family was disgraced, retreating from society under a cloud of shame. Lady Beatrice Finch, in a move of breathtaking hypocrisy, publicly declared she had been on the verge of uncovering Richard's duplicity herself, and had been deceived just as much as everyone else. No one believed her. Thanks to the Duke's foresight and Thomas Finch's meticulous work, every penny invested by Samuel Croft and the other victims was recovered before it could disappear. The Croft family was not just saved from ruin, they were made whole. But the true victory was not financial. It was personal. Annalise Croft was no longer seen as the jilted girl. She was the Croft Fury, the Duke's champion, a woman of substance and steel who had risen from the ashes of her own public humiliation to deliver karmic justice. She received callers, invitations, and notes of admiration from people who had once whispered about her behind their fans. She politely declined them all. She had no interest in rejoining the game she had so thoroughly won. One crisp autumn afternoon, a week after the masquerade, Gideon called on her. He found her not in the drawing room, but in the small garden behind the house, tending to a late-blooming rose bush. She wore a simple day dress, her hair was unadorned, and he thought she had never looked more beautiful. She smiled when she saw him, a genuine, untroubled smile that reached her eyes. "Your Grace, I was hoping you would come." "I came to see how you were faring," he said, his usual formal tone softened by the quiet intimacy of the garden. "I am well," she said, snipping a pale pink rose. "My father is himself again. My mother is already planning how to redecorate the drawing room. And She paused, looking at the rose in her hand. "I feel as if I am breathing freely for the first time in my life." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, the sounds of the city muffled and distant. "You never told me why you truly did it, Gideon," she said, using his given name for the first time. The sound of it on her lips was both strange and perfectly natural. It was more than just a distaste for peacocks and cheats. I saw it in your eyes that night at the ball. He looked away, towards the grey stone wall of the garden, the formidable defences of his heart momentarily breached. "I told you about my mother," he said, his voice low. "After the trial, after we had lost everything, she faded. The shame, the public scorn, it was a disease and it consumed her. She died a year later. The doctors called it consumption. I knew the truth. She died of a broken spirit." He finally turned to look at her, his eyes raw with a pain he had carried for 15 years. "When I saw you standing there, with that same pack of wolves circling, I wouldn't let them do it again. I wouldn't let them take another strong woman and grind her into dust." Annalise's heart ached, not with the memory of her own pain, but with empathy for his. The Ruthless Duke was a boy who had been powerless to save his mother, and had spent the rest of his life becoming powerful enough to save the world, if he had to. She stepped closer to him, her movements sure and deliberate. She reached out and placed the rose she held into the buttonhole of his coat. Her fingers brushed against the fine wool, and he stood perfectly still, as if her touch were both a balm and a brand. "Her heart may have been broken," Annalise said softly, her eyes holding his. "But her spirit lives on, in her son, the man who saw a woman in pain and, despite his reputation, despite the risk of scandal, was the only one who moved." She did not wait for him to respond. She rose on her toes and pressed a soft, gentle kiss to his lips. It was not a kiss of passion, but of gratitude, of understanding, of a profound and deep connection forged in a crucible of public scorn and private vengeance. Gideon's hands, which were always so controlled, came up to gently cup her face, his touch surprisingly tender. When they broke apart, the mask was gone. The Ruthless Duke was gone. In his place was just Gideon, a man whose carefully constructed walls had just been breached by the one person he had set out to save. Annalise. He breathed her name like a prayer. "You wagered on my strength," she whispered, her hand resting over his heart. "What will you wager now?" A slow, genuine smile finally transformed his face, chasing away the last of the shadows. It was a smile of hope, of promise, of a future he never thought he would have. "I'm wagering everything," he said. "On us." In the quiet London garden, far from the whispers and judgments of the ballroom, two hearts, once shielded and shattered, were finally reclaimed, not by society's approval, but by the unlikely, unbreakable alliance they had forged together. And so, a story that began with a heart shattered before everyone, ended with a love quietly pieced together in private. Annalise and Gideon proved that true strength isn't about avoiding humiliation, but about how you rise from it. Theirs was not a fairy tale romance, but a testament to resilience, a partnership built on mutual respect and the courage to fight back against the cruelty of the world. They didn't just find love, they forged it in the fire of adversity, creating a bond stronger than any society scandal. Did their story move you? Do you believe in the power of second chances and unexpected heroes? If you enjoyed this tale of justice and love found in the most unlikely of places, please show your support. Take a moment to hit that like button. Share this video with someone who loves a story of triumph. And most importantly, subscribe to the channel for more dramatic stories that remind us that even in the darkest moments, a single act of courage can change everything. Thank you for listening.